Crimea. October 1346. The stench hit you first. Not the smell of siege warfare, burning pitch and unwashed soldiers. This was different. This was the smell of rot accelerated, of flesh turning black and liquefying while still attached to living bodies. Inside the Mongol camp surrounding the Genoese fortress of Kaffa, men were dying. Not from arrows. Not from disease they understood. They were dying from something that turned their groins and armpits into swollen masses the size of apples, that blackened their fingers and toes, that killed them screaming within 3 days of the first fever. Khan Janabeg watched another soldier collapse. The man had been laughing with his companions that morning. Now he was convulsing in the dirt, blood leaking from his nose and mouth, buboes rupturing through his skin. Janabeg had seen death. He had ordered the execution of thousands. He had watched cities burn and populations slaughtered. But this was different. This death came without warning. This death spread like fire through dry grass. This death was winning the siege for the enemy without the enemy lifting a sword. And then Janabeg had an idea. An idea so brutal, so calculated, so unprecedented in the history of warfare that it would echo through 7 centuries and kill 75 million people. If death itself was spreading through his camp, why not share it with the enemy? If disease could defeat armies, why not weaponize disease? Why not load the corpses of plague victims into trebuchets and catapult them over the walls of Kaffa? Before we go further, comment below where you're watching this from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Are you in Europe where this happened? Asia where it started? America where it spread centuries later? Drop your location. Let's see how global this audience really is. The Mongol Empire in 1346 was the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Stretching from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to India, it controlled more territory than Rome at its height, more than Alexander's conquests, more than any empire before or since. The Mongols had conquered this territory through military innovation, through psychological warfare, through sheer ruthless efficiency. They had perfected the art of siege warfare, developing siege engines and tactics that could reduce fortified cities to rubble. They had pioneered intelligence gathering, using merchants and spies to map territories before invasion. They had weaponized terror, massacring entire populations to encourage surrender elsewhere. The Mongols understood warfare at a level that wouldn't be matched until the 20th century. But in October 1346, the Mongols were losing. They had been besieging Kaffa for months. Kaffa was a Genoese trading colony on the Crimean Peninsula, a fortified port city that served as the western terminus of the Silk Road. The city was wealthy, well-defended, and supplied by sea. The Genoese had built massive walls, stocked provisions for years, and maintained a garrison of professional soldiers. The Mongol siege should have worked. Janabeg commanded tens of thousands of mounted warriors. He had siege engines. He had experience. But Kaffa had one thing the Mongols couldn't overcome: access to the Black Sea. Genoese ships resupplied the city constantly, bringing food, weapons, reinforcements. The siege was stalemated. Janabeg's army was stuck outside the walls, burning resources, achieving nothing. And then plague arrived. Not as a military asset. As a catastrophe. The disease appeared first among Mongol soldiers in September 1346. One man developed fever. Then 10. Then hundreds. The victims developed massive swellings in their lymph nodes, buboes that grew until they burst, leaking pus and blood. Their extremities turned gangrenous black as blood vessels collapsed. They died raving, in agony, their bodies rotting before they stopped breathing. The Mongols had no name for this disease. They had no treatment. They had no understanding of how it spread. They only knew it was spreading fast. Within weeks, thousands of Mongol soldiers were dead. The siege was collapsing not from enemy action but from invisible enemy inside the camp. Janabeg faced a decision: retreat and abandon the siege, losing face and strategic position. Continue the siege and watch his army disintegrate from disease. Or do something unprecedented. Use the disease as a weapon. Turn catastrophe into strategy. Make the enemy share in the dying. The historical record is fragmentary. We have one primary source, an Italian notary named Gabriele de Mussi who was in Kaffa during the siege and survived to write about it. De Mussi describes the Mongol tactic in horrifying detail. The Mongols began collecting corpses of plague victims. Not for burial. For ammunition. They loaded the bodies into trebuchets, massive counterweight siege engines capable of hurling objects weighing hundreds of pounds over fortress walls. They adjusted the trajectories, and they launched the dead into Kaffa. Imagine being inside those walls. Imagine watching the sky. Imagine seeing objects arc overhead, silhouetted against the sun. Imagine realizing their bodies. Human corpses, bloated and rotting, tumbling through the air and crashing into your streets, your buildings, your water supplies. Imagine the psychological impact before the biological impact even begins. This wasn't conventional siege warfare. This wasn't burning pitch or diseased animal carcasses. This was human weaponization of human death. This was biological warfare on a scale never before attempted. The Genoese tried to dispose of the bodies. They threw them into the Black Sea. They burned them. They buried them in mass graves outside the city. But they were too late. The plague had entered Kaffa. Not just from the corpses, though historians debate whether corpse transmission was actually effective, but from the rats. Because while the Genoese were focused on the dramatic horror of bodies flying over walls, the real vectors were entering Kaffa through mundane means. Rats infested the Mongol camp. Rats carrying fleas. Fleas carrying Yersinia pestis. And rats don't respect siege walls. Rats squeeze through gaps. Rats swim across moats. Rats infiltrate cities under cover of darkness while humans sleep. The theatrical biological warfare, the corpse catapulting, may have been psychologically effective but probably wasn't the primary transmission route. The rats were. Within weeks, plague was epidemic inside Kaffa. The Genoese began dying at the same rate as the Mongols. The city's hospitals overflowed. The streets filled with corpses. The carefully maintained siege discipline collapsed into chaos as soldiers and civilians alike fell to disease. And here's where the story becomes global. Because the Genoese didn't stay in Kaffa. They fled. In October 1347, 12 Genoese merchant ships departed Kaffa, sailing west across the Black Sea, through the Bosporus, into the Mediterranean. They were fleeing plague. But they were carrying plague. In their holds, among the cargo of silk and spices, were rats. Infected rats. Rats whose fleas carried plague bacteria. The ships were floating incubators, death ships that would seed plague outbreaks at every port they touched. Stop and think about that. 12 ships. Just 12. Carrying perhaps 1,000 men total and unknown thousands of rats. Those 12 ships spread plague to Constantinople, to Sicily, to Genoa, to Marseille, to Barcelona. From those port cities, plague spread inland along trade routes, carried by merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, refugees. By 1348, plague had reached Paris and London. By 1349, it had reached Scandinavia and Ireland. By 1351, it had penetrated Russia and reached the borders of Arabia. In less than 5 years, plague spread from Kaffa to every corner of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. 75 to 200 million people died. 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population. Comparable proportions in Asia and the Middle East. And it started at Kaffa. At a siege where a Mongol Khan made the calculated decision to weaponize death itself. Now here's where this gets controversial, and I want your take on this. Comment below. Was Janibeg responsible for the Black Death? Or was he just accelerating something that would have happened anyway? Because plague was already circulating in Central Asia. It was already spreading along trade routes. Kaffa might have been where it entered Europe, but was that because of Mongol biological warfare or just because Kaffa was a major trade hub? Drop your opinion. Let's debate this. The answer is complicated. Modern epidemiological analysis suggests the corpse catapulting probably wasn't the primary transmission vector. Plague is caused by Yersinia pestis bacteria. The bacteria live in fleas. The fleas live on rats. For a human corpse to transmit plague effectively, it would need to be fresh enough that fleas are still alive and active on the body. A corpse that's been dead for days, bloated and decomposing, probably doesn't have live fleas. The fleas would have jumped to new hosts or died. So the theatrical horror of catapulting corpses was probably more psychological warfare than effective biological warfare. But here's the thing. It doesn't matter. Janabeg's intention was to weaponize plague. His understanding of disease transmission was wrong. He probably thought plague spread through miasma, through corrupted air emanating from corpses. But his strategic calculation was correct. He recognized that disease was a weapon. He recognized that spreading disease to the enemy would benefit his military objectives. He pioneered the concept of biological warfare, the deliberate use of pathogens to harm enemy populations. Whether his specific tactic was effective is less important than the fact that he tried. He established a precedent. He demonstrated that commanders would weaponize disease if they believed it would bring victory. And that precedent has been followed. The Spanish conquistadors gave smallpox-contaminated blankets to Native American populations in the 16th century. British forces did the same to indigenous populations in North America in the 18th century. Japanese Unit 731 experimented with plague bombs in China during World War II, infecting civilians with plague-infected fleas dropped from aircraft. The Soviet Union and the United States both developed biological weapons programs during the Cold War, weaponizing anthrax, plague, smallpox, and other pathogens. North Korea and Syria are suspected of maintaining biological weapons programs today. The line from Kaffa to modern biological weapons is direct and unbroken. Janabeg showed that disease could be weaponized. Every subsequent biological weapons program has followed that precedent. But let's go deeper. Let's talk about what this reveals about the Mongol Empire and its strategic thinking. Because the corpse catapulting wasn't an isolated incident. It was consistent with Mongol warfare philosophy. The Mongols were pragmatists. They used whatever tools brought victory. They pioneered gunpowder weapons, adopting Chinese technology and integrating it into their military. They used psychological warfare systematically, spreading stories of Mongol atrocities to encourage cities to surrender without resistance. They employed intelligence networks that spanned continents, gathering information about enemies before engaging them. They adapted tactics based on terrain and enemy capabilities, fighting differently against Chinese infantry, European knights, and Persian cavalry. The Mongols were military innovators on a scale Europe wouldn't match until Napoleon. So when plague appeared in Janabeg's camp, his response was characteristically Mongol. Don't waste the catastrophe. Use it. Turn weakness into strength. If disease is killing your soldiers, make it kill enemy soldiers too. Weaponize the plague. The fact that this idea occurred to Janabeg reveals something about Mongol strategic culture. They thought outside conventional frameworks. They broke rules that others considered sacred. Dead bodies were sacred in most cultures. You buried your dead with honor. You respected enemy dead according to rules of war. The Mongols used dead bodies as ammunition. That's not cruelty for cruelty's sake. That's ruthless pragmatism. That's a military culture that subordinated everything to victory. And it worked. Not the way Janabeg intended. The corpses probably didn't transmit much plague. But the siege of Kaffa ended. The Mongols withdrew. Whether they withdrew because plague had devastated their forces, or because they accomplished their objective of spreading plague to the enemy, or because winter was approaching and the siege was no longer sustainable, the historical record is unclear. But Kaffa fell eventually. Not to Mongol conquest but to plague. The city was depopulated. The Genoese lost control. The Mongol Golden Horde gained dominance over the Crimean Peninsula. Janabeg's strategic objective was achieved, even if not through direct military victory. Now let's talk about what happened next. Because the story doesn't end at Kaffa. Those 12 Genoese ships that fled Kaffa became the most consequential voyages in human history. They carried plague to Europe. But more than that, they demonstrated how quickly disease could spread in the medieval world. The Mongol Empire had created an interconnected world. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, had made trade routes safe from China to the Mediterranean. Merchants traveled freely. Goods flowed east and west. Information spread faster than ever before. The Mongols had essentially created the first globalized economy, 7 centuries before we use that term. But connectivity cuts both ways. The same trade routes that carried silk and spices also carried rats. The same merchant ships that made fortunes also spread plague. The Mongol Empire, by connecting Eurasia into a single economic network, created the infrastructure for pandemic spread. Plague had existed in Central Asia for millennia, circulating in wild rodent populations. But it had never spread globally because global connections didn't exist. The Mongol Empire created those connections, and plague exploited them. This is the Mongol Empire's darkest secret. Not the corpse catapulting at Kaffa, though that's dramatic and horrifying. The real secret is that the Mongol Empire created the conditions for the Black Death to become a pandemic. Mongol conquest connected east and west. Mongol trade routes moved goods and people across continents. Mongol military movements displaced populations and spread disease vectors. The Mongols didn't intentionally create the Black Death. Plague existed before the Mongol Empire. But Mongol actions made the Black Death possible on the scale it occurred. 75 million people died because the Mongols built an empire so vast and connected that disease could spread from Central Asia to Iceland in less than a decade. And here's the kicker: the Mongols knew. Maybe not in epidemiological terms. Maybe not with understanding of bacteria and transmission vectors. But they knew disease was spreading along their trade routes. They knew cities along the Silk Road were experiencing plague outbreaks. They knew their armies were vulnerable to disease in ways they couldn't control. And they kept trading. They kept moving. They kept connecting. Because the economic and political benefits of empire outweighed the disease risks. The Mongols made a calculated decision to prioritize trade and conquest over disease control. Sound familiar? Because we're making the same calculation today. We live in a globalized world connected by air travel, shipping, internet. COVID-19 spread from Wuhan to every country on Earth in 3 months because we built the infrastructure for it to spread. We knew pandemics were possible. We knew global connectivity increased pandemic risk. We kept flying. We kept trading. We kept connecting. Because the economic benefits outweighed the perceived risks. Until they didn't. Until millions died and economies collapsed, and we realized maybe we should have paid more attention to pandemic preparedness. The Mongols faced the same choice in the 14th century. Connect the world and accept pandemic risk, or isolate and stay safe but poor. They chose connection. We've chosen connection. And both choices led to pandemics that killed millions. Let me hear from you again. Are we repeating Mongol mistakes? Or is global connection worth the pandemic risk? Drop a comment. This is the fundamental question of our time. I want to know what you think. Let's talk about Janabeg himself. Because he's the protagonist of this story and we need to understand who he was. Janabeg was Khan of the Golden Horde, the Mongol Khanate that controlled the western steppes, Russia, and parts of Eastern Europe. He came to power in 1342, inheriting an empire in decline. The Golden Horde was fragmenting. Regional governors were asserting independence. Trade revenues were declining. Military power was eroding. Janabeg needed a victory. He needed to demonstrate strength, reassert authority, remind everyone that the Golden Horde remained a force to be feared. Kaffa was the target. Kaffa represented Genoese commercial power in Mongol territory. The Genoese had negotiated trading rights in the Crimea, but they were essentially a foreign power operating on Mongol land, extracting wealth through trade and paying minimal tribute. Janabeg wanted to destroy Kaffa, or at least bring it to heel, demonstrating that foreign merchants operated in Mongol territory only with Mongol permission. The siege was about power, about money, about empire. And then plague arrived and changed everything. Janabeg's carefully planned siege became a desperate struggle for survival. His army was disintegrating. His soldiers were dying in agony. His carefully maintained authority was collapsing as men deserted or died or simply refused to follow orders from commanders who couldn't protect them from invisible death. Janabeg was losing control. And for a Mongol Khan, losing control meant death. Rival claimants would challenge him. Governors would rebel. The empire would fragment further. Janabeg needed to regain initiative. He needed to do something dramatic that would demonstrate he still commanded events. So he catapulted corpses. Was it militarily effective? Probably not. Was it strategically brilliant? Absolutely. Because Janabeg regained narrative control. He transformed from a Khan whose army was being destroyed by disease into a Khan who weaponized disease against his enemies. He turned weakness into aggression. He demonstrated the Mongol willingness to do whatever it took to win. The psychological impact on the Genoese must have been devastating. They were already terrified of the Mongols. Now they watched Mongol trebuchets hurling plague victims into their city. The message was clear: the Mongols will make you share in their suffering. Surrender or die. There is no third option. The Genoese didn't surrender. They fled. Which, from Janabeg's perspective, was victory. Kaffa was neutralized. Genoese commercial power in the Crimea was broken. The Golden Horde retained control of the region. Mission accomplished. Except Janabeg died within 2 years. Probably from plague. The disease he weaponized likely killed him. There's a poetic justice there, a karmic retribution that medieval chroniclers noted with satisfaction. The Khan who used plague as a weapon became plague's victim. But Janabeg's death didn't stop the Black Death. The pandemic he helped spread continued for years, killing millions, transforming civilizations. Janabeg was a catalyst. His actions at Kaffa accelerated plague's entry into Europe. He's personally responsible for initiating the chain of events that led to the Black Death in Europe. How responsible? That's debatable. Plague was already spreading along Silk Road trade routes. It would likely have reached Europe eventually even without the siege of Kaffa. But Kaffa was the entry point. Those 12 Genoese ships departing Kaffa in October 1347 were the specific vectors that seeded European plague outbreaks. And those ships fled Kaffa because of Mongol siege and the plague conditions Janabeg's army created. The causal chain is indirect but real. Janabeg's decisions at Kaffa in 1346 contributed to deaths across Europe in 1348 to 1351. Not solely responsible, but contributory responsible. Now, let's examine the technology. Because biological warfare at Kaffa was enabled by siege warfare technology. The trebuchet was the key weapon. Trebuchets are counterweight siege engines, essentially massive catapults that use a heavy counterweight to launch projectiles over fortress walls. The Mongols had adopted trebuchet technology from Chinese engineers and improved it. Mongol trebuchets could throw stones weighing 300 pounds over 300 yards with reasonable accuracy. They were the artillery of medieval warfare, capable of reducing fortress walls to rubble or launching projectiles over walls to damage buildings and kill defenders inside. Trebuchets normally launched stones or flaming projectiles. Occasionally they launched diseased animal carcasses, dead horses or cattle thrown into besieged cities to contaminate water supplies or spread disease. But human corpses? That was new. That required Janabeg to recognize that human corpses carrying plague could function as biological weapons. It required engineers to calculate trajectories for irregular objects that didn't fly like stones. It required soldiers willing to handle plague corpses, loading them into trebuchets despite the obvious risk of contracting plague themselves. The whole operation required organization, planning, and willingness to transgress cultural norms about treatment of the dead. The Mongols did it because they were culturally flexible. Mongol religious practice was shamanistic and pragmatic. They respected other religions. The Mongol Empire included Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, and practitioners of various folk religions. But Mongols themselves didn't have rigid religious prohibitions about handling corpses. Dead bodies were bodies, meat that no longer housed a living spirit. Using them as weapons was unorthodox but not sacrilegious from the Mongol perspective. Europeans would have been horrified by the idea. Christian religious doctrine emphasized the sanctity of the dead and the importance of proper burial. But Mongols had different values. And that cultural difference enabled the first recorded use of biological warfare. Let's talk consequences. Because the siege of Kaffa didn't just spread plague. It changed warfare forever. Before Kaffa, biological warfare was theoretical. After Kaffa, it was demonstrated. Commanders across Eurasia learned that disease could be weaponized. They learned that epidemic disease could achieve strategic objectives that conventional military force couldn't. They learned that invisible weapons could be more effective than visible weapons. and they started thinking about how to replicate Janabeg's tactic. The problem was disease couldn't be controlled. Janabeg learned this the hard way. The plague he weaponized killed his own soldiers and possibly killed him. Biological weapons are double-edged swords. They don't distinguish friend from enemy. They spread based on biological factors, not military logic. A commander who unleashes disease might win the battle but lose the war as his own forces die from the weapon he deployed. This is why biological weapons were rarely used historically, despite being demonstrated at Kaffa. The risk of blowback was too high. Modern biological weapons programs tried to solve this problem. They developed vaccines for their own populations, so deployed diseases would only affect enemy populations. They developed delivery mechanisms, bombs, missiles, sprayers, that could target specific areas without contaminating friendly territory. They genetically engineered pathogens to be more lethal, more contagious, more stable in environmental conditions. They turned biological warfare from crude corpse catapulting into precision weapon systems. But the fundamental problem remains. Disease spreads. Pathogens mutate. Vaccines fail. Accidents happen. Every biological weapons program in history has experienced accidental releases that killed their own people. The Soviet Union's Aralsk incident in 1971 killed 3 people from weaponized smallpox that escaped a testing facility. The U.S. Army's experiments at Dugway Proving Ground killed thousands of sheep in 1968 when nerve agent drifted off target. Biological weapons are inherently unstable. Janabeg learned this in 1346. We're still learning it today. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Janabeg's tactic worked. Kaffa fell. The siege ended. The Golden Horde retained control of the Crimea. And the fact that plague spread across Europe and killed millions? That wasn't Janabeg's problem. That was Europe's problem. From a cold strategic perspective, Janabeg achieved his objectives at minimal cost to his own empire. The Golden Horde territories in Central Asia and Russia were already experiencing plague before the siege of Kaffa. Janabeg didn't introduce plague to his own territories. It was already there. He just shared it with Europe. And Europe, unprepared and lacking basic understanding of disease transmission, suffered catastrophically while the Mongol Empire weathered the pandemic relatively intact. This reveals something important about pandemic dynamics. Preparedness matters. The Mongols had experienced plague before Kaffa. They had some immunity, some behavioral adaptations, some experience managing epidemic disease. Europe had none of that. Plague arrived in Europe as a novel pathogen, encountering populations with no immunity and no experience. The death rates were correspondingly catastrophic. Same disease, different outcomes based on preparedness. Sound familiar? COVID-19 affected different countries differently based on preparedness, healthcare infrastructure, and prior epidemic experience. Countries that had experienced SARS or MERS had better responses than countries experiencing their first novel coronavirus. The lesson from Kaffa and the lesson from COVID-19 is identical. Preparedness determines outcomes. You can't prevent pandemics, but you can prepare for them. And preparation saves millions of lives. One more call to action before we finish. If you've made it this far, you're part of the small percentage who actually watches to the end. Comment Kaffa below so I know you're here. And tell me, what historical event should I cover next? What story from history needs to be told? Drop your suggestions. I read every comment. Let's bring this home. The siege of Kaffa in 1346 was a turning point in human history. It was the first recorded use of biological warfare. It was the entry point for plague into Europe, initiating the Black Death. It demonstrated the Mongol Empire's pragmatic ruthlessness and willingness to weaponize anything, including death itself. It showed how military decisions can cascade into civilizational catastrophes. And it established a precedent for biological warfare that continues to this day. Janabeg probably didn't intend to kill 75 million people. He intended to win a siege. He intended to demonstrate Mongol power and reassert control over rebellious territory. But his decision to catapult plague corpses into Kaffa initiated a chain of events that transformed history. Those 12 Genoese ships fleeing Kaffa became the vectors for Europe's worst catastrophe. The rats in their holds carried fleas, the fleas carried bacteria, and the bacteria killed 30 to 60% of Europe's population. The Mongol Empire's darkest secret isn't the conquests, the massacres, or the destruction of civilizations. Those were visible atrocities, documented and remembered. The darkest secret is the invisible atrocity, the pandemic they helped spread, the disease that killed more people than all Mongol military conquests combined. Genghis Khan and his successors killed perhaps 40 million people through warfare. The plague that spread partly because of Mongol actions killed 200 million. The invisible weapon was deadlier than all the swords and arrows and siege engines. And we haven't learned. We still build global networks that spread disease. We still prioritize economic connection over pandemic preparedness. We still make calculated decisions to accept pandemic risk because isolation costs more than preparation. We're still Mongols building trade routes across continents, knowing disease will follow but hoping we can manage the consequences. Sometimes we can. Sometimes we can't. And when we can't, millions die, just like they died in 1346, just like they've died in every pandemic since. The rats are still here. The fleas are still here. The bacteria are still here. We've added airplanes and global supply chains and 8 billion people living in dense cities. We've created the infrastructure for pandemic spread on a scale Janabeg couldn't have imagined. His 12 ships became thousands of flights per day. His trade routes became instant global communication. His catapulted corpses became weaponized pathogens engineered in laboratories. We're living in the world Janabeg helped create. A connected world. A dangerous world. A world where disease spreads at the speed of commerce, where pandemics can emerge anywhere and spread everywhere, where the decisions of commanders and governments can kill millions even when they don't intend to. The Mongol Empire collapsed centuries ago, but its legacy persists. We're still dealing with consequences of choices made at Kaffa in 1346. We're still vulnerable to the weapon Janabeg pioneered. We're still fighting the same war between connection and safety, between empire and survival, between the visible weapons that make us feel powerful and the invisible weapons that actually kill. The siege ended. The empire fell. The Khan died. But the plague continues. Different strains, different names, different transmission routes. But always the same fundamental threat. Invisible death spreading through populations faster than we can respond, exploiting the connections we build, killing millions before we can stop it. That's the secret. That's the legacy. That's why Kaffa matters 7 centuries later. Because we're still besieged. We're still surrounded by invisible enemies. We're still making the same calculations Janabeg made. And we're still dying from decisions made generations ago by people who thought they were just winning a war. Comment below. Share this. Make sure this story gets told. Because the people who don't learn from Kaffa are doomed to repeat it. And we're repeating it. Right now. Today. The rats are in the walls. The fleas are on the rats. The bacteria are in the fleas. And we're all inside the walls of Kaffa, watching the sky, wondering when the next plague corpse will arc over the wall and crash into our streets. The siege never ended. We just stopped noticing. Until it's too late. Until the pandemic starts. Until millions die. Again. And again. And again. The Mongol Empire's darkest secret is that they showed us how to weaponize death. And we've been using that weapon ever since. On ourselves.